She almost deleted the message without opening it. It came through on a platform she barely used anymore. A DM from an account with no profile picture and a username that looked like a first name followed by a string of numbers. The kind of account you make when the one with your actual name already exists somewhere else. She stared at it for a full minute before she tapped it open. "Hi, I know this is strange and I'm sorry for reaching out this way. I dated Marcus for about 1.5 years. I'm not doing this to cause problems or because I still have feelings for him. I just wish someone had warned me before I got too far in. So I'm doing the thing I wanted someone to do for me. You don't have to reply." She read it 3 times. Then she set her phone face down on the counter and went about her morning, made coffee, fed the cat, replied to 2 work emails. She told herself it was probably jealousy. She told herself the reasonable interpretation was someone who hadn't moved on, who had found her profile through his, who wanted to plant a seed and watch it grow from a safe distance. She'd heard about this. Women who couldn't let go, who reframed the ending as something done to them, who needed the new person to be suffering in order to feel less alone in their own suffering. She was pretty sure she understood what this was. She picked the phone back up 40 minutes later and typed, "I'm listening." What came back was not what she expected. It wasn't angry. It wasn't a list of accusations or a dramatic retelling of scenes designed to make Marcus look like a monster. It was, and this is the part she kept coming back to in the days that followed, it was specific. The woman on the other end, whose name was Priya, described behaviors in a particular sequence. Small things at first. The way Marcus had of going quiet when she brought up the future. Not cold exactly, just suddenly less present, as though a door had swung almost all the way closed without quite latching. The way he framed his friendships with other women. Always preemptively. Always with a slight edge of, "Can you believe some people are so insecure?" A framing that made her feel, before she'd expressed any concern at all, that expressing concern would make her exactly the kind of woman he'd described. She was reading this on her phone in her kitchen in the middle of a Tuesday, and her chest had begun to do something she didn't have a word for yet. Because she knew that framing. She had felt it. She had, in fact, recently told her friend Danny that she was trying to work on her trust issues, because Marcus had helped her see that some of her reactions were probably about her past and not about him. She had said those words out loud. She had believed them. She typed back, "How long did it take you to figure out that the issue wasn't you?" Priya's reply came fast, like she'd been waiting for exactly that question. "About 14 months in," she wrote, "and only because a friend asked me to describe a specific incident out loud to a third party, and I heard myself doing it, and something shifted. Like, I heard the story and I thought, I wouldn't advise anyone to stay in this. But I was still in it." She put the phone down again, went to the window. The day outside was doing nothing remarkable. Gray sky, a dog walking its owner past the building across the street. An ordinary Tuesday proceeding at its ordinary pace. She thought about Marcus, who was at work right now, who had kissed her this morning and called her by the name he used only when he was being tender, who had, 3 weeks ago, told her that she was the most emotionally mature person he'd ever been with. She had held that compliment close. She had repeated it to herself on hard days. She thought about Priya, who she had never met, who had found her through some chain of digital breadcrumbs and decided, for no benefit to herself, at real personal cost, to send a message that she knew might be ignored, or worse, reported back. She picked up the phone one more time. "Can I ask you something?" she typed. The things he did, the specific things, did they escalate? Or was it always the same level? There was a pause, longer than before. Then, "They escalate. That's actually why I'm reaching out now and not a year ago. With me, they escalated." She set the phone down. She did not pick it up again for 2 hours. She needed to think. And that pause, those 2 hours of sitting with something she couldn't yet name, is where this story actually begins. Her name was Zoe. She was 34. She had a job she was good at, an apartment she loved, a therapist she saw every other Tuesday who had told her, more than once, that she had done meaningful work on her attachment patterns. She was not naive. She was not someone who missed obvious signs. She was, by any reasonable measure, a woman who had learned from the past. She had met Marcus at a friend's birthday dinner, one of those crowded restaurant tables where everyone is slightly too loud and the wine arrives faster than the food. He was at the other end of the table, and she noticed him the way you notice someone who isn't performing. He was genuinely listening to the person beside him, actually listening, not waiting for his turn, not scanning the room. She watched him for a while before he looked up and caught her doing it, and instead of pretending she hadn't been, she raised her glass slightly. He smiled. Not a charming smile, just a real one. That was the beginning of it, the realness of him. They talked for 2 hours after dinner, standing on the pavement outside while everyone else drifted off in cabs. He asked questions that assumed she had interior depth. He remembered the answers. When she mentioned in passing that her last relationship had ended badly, she didn't go into it, just a brushstroke. He didn't push. He said simply, "Those things leave marks. I get it," and moved on. She thought about that on the bus home. The not pushing. She was so used to men who treated vulnerability like an opening, a door they immediately wanted to walk through and rearrange the furniture. He had just acknowledged the thing and left her in charge of it. By the third date, she was already recalibrating how careful to be. This is important. Not because it makes what happened her fault. It doesn't, and it isn't. But because it's where the architecture began. Marcus was extraordinary at the beginning. Not flashy extraordinary. Not grand gestures and overwhelming attention. The more subtle kind. The kind where someone seems to truly see you, truly get you, truly be on your side. The kind that feels, for the first time in a long time, like rest. And when you've been tired, rest can make you lower your guard in ways you wouldn't otherwise. If you're watching Wettedy for the first time, this is what we do here. We slow it down. We look at the thing that didn't feel like a pattern until it was one. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing clearly. They dated for 7 months before she met any of his friends. She noticed at the time, but told herself it was a pacing thing. He was private, she was private. They were both people who moved carefully. He had mentioned his friends in stories, named them, described scenes and dinners and weekend trips. They existed in his life. She just hadn't been introduced to them yet. What she hadn't noticed, what she would only notice much later, sitting with Priya's message on a Tuesday morning, was that she had met all of her own friends first. He had been folded into her world while remaining largely a closed book about his own. It hadn't felt like withholding. It had felt like she was the more social one, the one with the bigger circle, the one whose world was simply easier to enter. That's one of the things she would later put on the list. The list didn't exist yet at this point. It would exist by the end of the week. She had called Priya back, an actual phone call, which felt both necessary and slightly surreal, and they had talked for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Priya was measured, not melodramatic. She was a project manager. She approached the conversation the way Zoe imagined she approached everything. Organized, evidence-based, aware that her own perception was not the same as proof, but clear about what the evidence pointed to. At one point she said, "I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I just have a lot of notes, and I wanted someone else to see them. Because when it's just your notes, you can always find a reason to discount them." Zoe asked her to describe the escalation, how it had moved, what it had moved from and toward. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, It started with small corrections. The way I remembered things. The way I described situations to other people. He would listen to me tell a story in a group and then later, privately, walk me through where I'd gotten it slightly wrong. Gently. Always gently. And at first, I actually appreciated it. I thought, here is someone who cares about accuracy, who is honest with me. It took me a long time to notice that the corrections only ever ran one direction. Zoe wrote that down. She didn't know why she wrote it down. But something in her hands already knew what her mind was still arguing about. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that, there's something you need to understand. About what Priya found when she finally started looking at the timeline from the outside in. Priya had kept a notes app. She mentioned it almost apologetically, like she knew how it sounded. A woman documenting her own relationship in real time, building a case file on the man she was sleeping next to. But she explained it the way Zoe would later explain it to her friend Danny, when she was trying to describe how something like this happens to someone like her. You don't start writing things down because you think something is wrong. You start writing things down because you keep forgetting your own version of events. And at some point you realize those two things are connected. The notes went back 17 months. Priya read some of them aloud on the phone, and what struck Zoe, what stayed with her long after the call ended, was not the incidents themselves, it was the language. The entries from the first 4 or 5 months were written in a particular register, uncertain, self-questioning, full of phrases like, I might be misreading this, and he probably didn't mean it that way, and I think I was tired, so maybe I heard it wrong. The entries from months 10 through 14 were written in a completely different voice, flatter, more precise, less apology in them. Priya noticed the shift herself, reading them back. That's when I knew I'd been changing, she said. Not growing, changing. Shrinking into a shape that fit the space he left for me. That phrase, shrinking into a shape that fit the space he left for me, is worth sitting with for a moment. Because that is not something that happens overnight. That is months of small calibrations, months of learning, without being taught directly, which version of yourself is welcome in the room and which one makes things harder. By the time you notice the shape, you've already been living inside it for a long time. The corrections Priya had described in their first conversation were only the surface. Beneath them was something with more structure. Marcus had a way of managing the narrative around him, not dramatically, not in any way that would read as controlling to an outside observer, but consistently. When Priya told stories about things they'd done together, he would sometimes add details afterward, privately, that subtly repositioned him in them. He hadn't been distant that weekend. He'd been worried about her, actually. Hadn't she noticed? He hadn't snapped at her in front of her colleagues. He'd been responding to a tone she'd set, which she might not have been aware of herself. He was always, in the revised version, more attentive and more generous than the original version had suggested. And she, in the revised version, was always slightly more difficult. She said, "After a while, I stopped telling stories about us, not because he told me to, because the revision process had become exhausting. It was easier to just not have the story in the first place." Zoe was sitting on her kitchen floor by this point. She didn't remember sliding down to it. She had her back against the cabinet and her phone pressed to her ear, and she was thinking about a dinner party 3 months ago, her friends, her flat, her carefully made food, where she had told a story about a weekend trip she and Marcus had taken, and Marcus had laughed along with everyone, and then later, on the walk home, had said quietly, "You made it sound like I was sulking the whole time. I wasn't sulking. I was tired. You know there's a difference." And she had apologized. She had actually apologized for describing her own memory inaccurately. She had not told a story about the two of them since. She said to Priya, "Did he ever tell you that you had a problem with trust?" A pause, then, in those exact words, yes. Early on, before I'd expressed any distrust whatsoever. It was almost like... She stopped. like he was filing the paperwork ahead of time, so that when I eventually did become anxious, the explanation was already in place. There it is, the thing Zoe had been circling without being able to name it. Not a man who reacted to a woman's distrust, a man who installed the diagnosis before the symptom appeared, so that whatever came later, her questions, her discomfort, her noticing, could be filed under her problem and not his behavior. If you have ever loved someone who made you feel like your own perceptions needed a second opinion, drop a 1 in the comments. Because Zoe is not the only one who had to slide down to the kitchen floor to understand something that had been true for months. Hold on to that, because there is one more thing Priya said before they got off the phone. Something Zoe almost let pass, almost filed under probably nothing. And it is the detail that changes the entire shape of what you think you are watching. Before they got off the phone, Priya said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it without it changing how you feel about reaching out to me." Zoe said, "Okay." Priya said, "You are not the first person I contacted." The kitchen was very quiet. Priya explained it carefully, the way she explained everything, in sequence, without editorializing. 8 months after she and Marcus ended, she had come across a name. Not through anything dramatic, through a mutual acquaintance mentioning, in passing, that Marcus was seeing someone. A woman named Sasha. Priya had looked her up, had found her, had sent her a message very similar to the one she had sent Zoe. Polite, specific, offering information rather than demanding belief. Sasha had not replied. 2 weeks later, Priya received a message from a number she didn't recognize. It was Marcus. He knew she'd reached out. He told her, in the kind of language that is technically calm and is actually a warning, that what she was doing was harassment. That Sasha had found the message upsetting. That Priya needed to understand that her perception of their relationship was not the reality of it, and that continuing to act on a distorted version of events was going to have consequences for her, not for him. Priya did not reply. She also did not delete the message. She screenshotted it and put it in a folder she had labeled, with the flat precision of someone who has moved past the point of feeling much. Simply, Marcus. She said to Zoe, "I don't know what he told Sasha about me. I don't know what version of me she received, but I know he found out about my message within 48 hours, which means she told him. Which means, at that point, she believed him more than she believed me." I understood that. I had done the same thing at the beginning, when a different woman had tried to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. Zoe's mouth had gone dry. She said, "There was someone before you?" Priya said, "Yes. I only found out after we ended." She had sent him a message once, when we were about 3 months in, and he showed it to me. He said she was unstable, that she had fabricated things between them, that he felt sorry for her but she'd become frightening, and he didn't know how to make her stop. I believed him completely. I helped him draft a response that would make her feel heard without encouraging further contact. I sat next to him and helped him word it. She stopped reaching out after that, and I remember being grateful that he trusted me enough to include me in it. She helped him write the reply? She sat beside him and helped him close the door on the woman who was trying to warn her. Not because she was cruel, because he had already built the architecture, the diagnosis, the framing, the carefully installed idea that women who questioned him were unstable, and women who trusted him were perceptive. By the time the warning arrived, Priya was already inside the system. She couldn't see the door from where she was standing. Zoe sat on that kitchen floor for a long time after the call ended. She was doing arithmetic she didn't want to do. There was the woman before Priya. There was Priya. There was Sasha, who had received Priya's message and chosen Marcus's version. And then there was Zoe, who had received Priya's message and, for a moment, on a Tuesday morning, had almost deleted it. She thought about what would have happened if she had. She thought about Marcus coming home that evening. the name he called her when he was being tender, the compliment she had held close and repeated to herself on hard days. Most emotionally mature person I've ever been with. She understood now that this was not a compliment. It was an installation. It was the version of her he needed her to believe in, so that when she eventually felt something difficult, doubt, discomfort, the particular unease of a person whose perceptions have been quietly rearranged, she would attribute it to her own history and not to him. She was the most emotionally mature person he'd ever been with. She was also the most recent. She opened her notes app for the first time, stared at the blank document for a moment. Then she started to type. Not accusations, not a timeline, not a case file. Just the name of every story about themselves that Marcus had quietly revised. Every incident she had stopped telling because the revision process was too exhausting. Every moment she had apologized for describing her own memory inaccurately. By the time Marcus's key turned in the lock that evening, she had been writing for 4 hours. She closed the notes app, set her phone face down on the counter, turned around and said, "Hey, how was your day?" And that, the 4 hours of writing, the face-down phone, the question asked in a perfectly ordinary voice, is where the second half of this story begins. She did not confront him that night. This is the part that surprises people when Zoe tells the story later. They expect action, the conversation, the accusation, the dramatic scene that functions as the story's hinge. But Zoe is a careful person. She had been careful all her life. And the irony of it, the particular bitterness of it, was that her carefulness had been reframed as a character flaw by the only man she had let herself stop being careful around. She was done letting that happen. So she watched instead. She had read Priya's notes. Priya had sent them the following morning, the full 17 months, without pressure and without apology. And what they gave her was not anger. What they gave her was a framework. A way of looking at behavior that she'd been seeing for 8 months and interpreting generously, that she could now interpret accurately. The first thing she tested was small. She told a story at dinner, just the two of them, a Wednesday, pasta she'd made from something she found at the back of a recipe book. A story about something that had happened at work, mildly funny, not about Marcus at all. She told it straight, the way she remembered it, without softening any edges. He laughed in the right places. And then, later, washing up, he said, "You know your director didn't actually say it was your idea in that meeting. He said it was a strong idea, and it came from a good team. There's a small difference. I just don't want you telling that version to people and then being embarrassed if it comes up." She dried her hands on the tea towel, said, "You're right, thanks," and filed it. Correction number 1. A work story, a version she had in no way embellished, revised within 40 minutes, and delivered as concern. I don't want you to be embarrassed. The care of it, the relentlessness of it dressed up as care. She tested again the following weekend. She mentioned, in front of mutual friends at the pub, that she'd been having a hard few weeks at work. Not dramatically, just honestly, the way people talk about their lives. On the walk home, Marcus was quiet in a way she recognized now as a specific quiet. Not tired quiet, not distracted quiet, but the quiet of a man building something he would deliver once the audience was gone. He said, "I notice you've been framing things quite negatively lately. I don't know if it's coming from the thing with your mom earlier in the year, or just where you're at, but I want to flag it because I think it's affecting how people see you, and you might not be aware of it." She said, "Thank you for telling me." She went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub for 3 minutes. Not because she was upset, because she was making sure the expression on her face was the right one before she went back out. Look at what just happened. She mentioned she was having a hard few weeks, a completely ordinary human thing to say, and within 2 hours it had been reclassified, connected to her mother, flagged as a pattern, reframed as something affecting how other people see her. A woman telling the truth about her own experience, revised in real time into evidence of her own instability. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just rerouted it. And she said thank you. On the Monday, she found Sasha, not through any particular detective work. She looked at the name Priya had given her, found a profile that was public enough, and sent a message that was almost word for word what Priya had sent her. Not because she expected anything, because the woman who had sat next to Marcus and helped him word the reply, the woman who had been grateful for that intimacy, deserved someone to try. Sasha read the message. Zoe could see it had been read. There was no reply. She had expected this. She left the conversation open anyway. What she had not expected was what happened 4 days later, when Marcus came home from work and sat down across from her at the kitchen table with the expression of a man who is about to be very reasonable at someone. He had a mutual acquaintance. The acquaintance knew Sasha peripherally. Apparently, Zoe had been in contact with his ex-girlfriend, which was strange, wasn't it? How would that come about? And he just wanted to understand, without getting into anything dramatic, what was going on. He was very calm. He used her name twice. He said, "I'm not angry. I'm concerned. That's a different thing." She looked at him across the table. This was the moment. Not the confrontation she hadn't planned. Something quieter and more final. The moment where she looked at him and understood, completely and without any remaining room for generous interpretation, exactly what she was looking at. And she held it, and she smiled, and she said, "It was a misunderstanding. I'll explain later. Are you hungry?" She was not going to explain later. She was not going to give him the chance to revise this one. She gave herself 2 weeks, not to decide. She had decided, there at the kitchen table, looking at a man who had used the words, "I'm not angry, I'm concerned," with the precision of someone who had used them before. The 2 weeks were logistical. She had a lease that was hers alone. She had finances that were hers alone. Another thing she had insisted on, early, that he had gently pushed back on twice before letting it go. She was grateful for that insistence now, in a way that made her want to cry. Not from sadness, but from the particular exhaustion of realizing how much quiet vigilance it had cost her to protect herself inside something that was supposed to feel like safety. She told no one what she was planning. Not Danny, not her sister, not Priya, though she and Priya had continued to message, carefully, away from any platform Marcus had ever touched. She gave nothing away because she understood, by now, that the moment Marcus sensed the narrative slipping, he would move to control it. He would have conversations with her people before she did. He would establish his version first, file it early, make sure that when her story arrived, it landed into soil he had already prepared. She was not going to let him do that. On a Saturday morning, while he was at the gym, she packed what she needed. Not everything, just what mattered. And she left a note on the counter that said only, "I think we want different things. I wish you well." She had written it 7 times before she got the tone right. Warm enough that it gave him nothing to push against. Final enough that it left no door. She was at her sister's by the time he got home. He called 4 times. She let them ring. His text moved through the stages she had expected. Confusion, then warmth, then a version of concern that was really a question about what she'd told people, then a longer message that reframed the entire relationship with a speed and fluency that confirmed everything Priya's notes had told her. He had the revised version ready. He had probably always had it ready. She screenshotted everything and added it to her own folder. She labeled it, with the same flat precision Priya had used, simply, Marcus. 3 weeks later, Sasha replied. She said, "I got your message. I'm sorry I didn't respond." I showed it to him, and I think I knew, the moment he wasn't surprised by it, that something was wrong. I didn't want to know that yet. "I'm sorry. Are you okay?" Zoe wrote back, "I'm okay. Are you?" They talked for 2 hours. Then the three of them, Zoe, Priya, Sasha, were in a group chat that none of them had named because naming it would have made it into something, and it was already something without the name. They didn't talk about Marcus much. Mostly they talked about the other things: their work, their weekends, a book Sasha was reading, a restaurant Priya had been to in Porto. The ordinary texture of lives that had continued and were continuing and were good. There is a woman before Priya whose name none of them know. She received a warning once and closed the door on it, and they have no way of reaching her. Zoe thinks about her sometimes, hopes she found her way to her own Tuesday morning, hopes someone sent her a message she was ready to open. Here is what Hanni wants you to hold from this one. The thing Marcus built was not a relationship. It was a system. And like all systems, it required maintenance. The constant, quiet work of keeping each part separate from the other parts, keeping each woman inside her own version of the story, making sure no one ever got close enough to compare notes. What he had not accounted for was Priya, who kept her notes in an app for 17 months and then decided, one afternoon, to send them somewhere. One message. That's the whole thing. One woman deciding that the thing she wished someone had done for her was worth doing for a stranger, even knowing the stranger might delete it without reading it. That is not a small thing to do. That is, in its quiet way, an extraordinary thing to do. Zoe almost deleted it. She set it down and went about her morning, and told herself she understood what it was. She didn't. But she came back to it. And that, the coming back, is what changed everything. You already knew, somewhere in you, what you were looking at. You just needed someone to send the message. Wettedy is that message. Subscribe so you never miss one. If someone in your life has ever made you feel like your own perceptions needed a second opinion, that experience does not belong in a folder labeled Your Issues. It belongs in the light. If this story reached you today, share it with someone you think it might reach too. There is a story coming next that starts with a woman who said nothing for years, and then one day said everything. To exactly the right person, at exactly the right moment. Stay close. This is Hanni. Wettedy just slows it down. I'll see you in the next one.